The sun hung low over the dusty plains, casting long shadows across the packed dirt of the auction grounds. The air was thick with sweat, heat, and something heavier, desperation. Farmers, ranchers, and merchants gathered like vultures around the wooden platform, murmuring and shouting over each other as the auctioneer's voice cut through the din like a whip. To most, it was just another day in the small frontier town of Delaney, Texas. But for Jacob Rowan, it was the kind of day that carves itself into a man's soul. Jacob stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his worn coat, his hat pulled low to shield tired eyes. His boots were coated in dry earth, like everything else in his life. Just over a year ago, he'd had a wife who sang to the chickens and a son who built stick forts beside the barn. Then came the fever, like a thief in the night. Now there was silence at the table, and Jacob had learned how to live with echoes. He didn't come to town for this. He came to trade his last good tools for seed or firewood. That's all. Nothing more. But then he saw them. A woman, her back straight despite the iron shackles at her wrists. Her eyes flicked over the crowd, scanning faces like a mother scanning the horizon for a storm. Beside her were 5 children, ranging in age from barely walking to nearly grown. The smallest girl gripped her brother's hand, her lips pressed into a line of fear she was too young to understand. The older boy stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, muscles twitching as though ready to run if there were anywhere left to run. The auctioneer called them a bundle, praised their strength and obedience. Good house stock, good field stock. He spoke of them like equipment, like furniture. Jacob felt a sickness rise in his gut, hot and sharp. He hadn't known what he would find in town, but it wasn't this. Not them. Something inside him moved, quiet at first, then thunderous. As the bidding began, the numbers flew high and loud. Ranchers eyed the family like prized cattle. Jacob couldn't take his eyes off the woman's face. There was no begging in her, only defiance tempered by exhaustion. The kind of strength that didn't ask for rescue, because it had long since stopped expecting it. Without fully knowing why, Jacob stepped forward. He reached into his coat and pulled out a cloth bundle, the one that held every coin he had left. The entire future of his crumbling farm. $23, he said. The crowd went silent. The auctioneer blinked, confused. You serious, Rowan? Jacob nodded once. When the hammer fell, the auctioneer laughed dryly. Well, damn. Sold to the saddest man I've seen all month. Jacob stepped forward. The family stared at him in silence, uncertain. He said only this, I didn't come to own you. I came to free you. And for the first time in a year, Jacob felt like a man who had something to live for. The moment Jacob Rowan's bid rang out, a hush swept over the crowd like a wind pulling breath from every mouth. The auctioneer froze mid-spiel, mouth slightly open, uncertain if he'd heard right. Jacob stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the shackled family in front of him. His voice had been quiet, but the weight behind it had landed like a hammer. No one had expected it. Jacob was a man known for silence and sorrow, not defiance. After losing his wife and boy, he had become something of a ghost around Delaney, still present, but faded. That he had shown up to a slave auction was odd enough. That he had bid? That was impossible. The murmurs started almost immediately. Did he say $23? He don't have 23 cents. He's lost his damn mind. But Jacob didn't flinch. He stepped forward and laid the coin pouch in the auctioneer's hand. The man opened it, counted quickly, then slowly shook his head in disbelief. Well, he muttered. He actually did it. Jacob didn't look at the crowd. He didn't care about their confusion or their mockery. His attention was locked on the woman and her children. She held her chin high, suspicion clouding her expression. The children looked between her and Jacob, trying to decipher what was happening. They had seen too many cruel hands in kind disguises to trust easily. The auctioneer gestured to Jacob. "They're yours now, Rowan. Take 'em." But Jacob didn't move to grab them. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small iron key, one he'd taken from the auction block moments earlier when no one was watching. He stepped toward the family slowly, cautiously, as though approaching a wounded animal. He knelt before the mother first. "May I?" he asked softly. Her eyes narrowed, but she gave a tiny nod. With trembling fingers, Jacob unlocked the heavy iron manacle from her wrist. The sound of it falling to the ground seemed to echo. One by one, he unlocked the others. The children watched in stunned silence as their chains dropped. It was as though the world had stopped spinning for a breath. "I didn't buy you," Jacob said, standing again. "I bought your freedom. If you want to walk away, you can. No strings. No debts." No one moved. The mother looked at her children. The smallest one had tears in her eyes, not of fear but of something softer, hope, maybe. The eldest son stared hard at Jacob, trying to read the truth in his weathered face. Finally, the mother spoke. "Why?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered easily. Jacob hesitated. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And no one should live in chains." There it was, the moment the crowd could not understand. The bid wasn't for property. It was for redemption. Not just theirs, but his too. And though the silence around them lingered, something invisible broke wide open in that space, a glimpse of humanity in a place built to erase it. The wagon creaked under the weight of 6 lives and the silence between them. As they left the edge of town, eyes followed them, some with ridicule, others with disbelief, and a rare few with something like wonder. The dirt road stretched ahead, leading them away from the cruelty of the auction block toward a place none of them could yet imagine calling home. Jacob Rowan guided the reins quietly, his weathered hands firm but calm. He didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew the moment needed gentleness, not explanations. The farmhouse came into view as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the fields. It was small, crooked in places, and barely holding together, but it stood. Weeds had taken over what used to be a garden. The barn leaned like an old man tired of standing. But to the family sitting in Jacob's wagon, it looked like the first place that hadn't meant pain in a long, long time. When they arrived, Jacob climbed down and opened the gate. He motioned for them to follow, not with command, but invitation. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's safe." The mother, whose name he'd learned was Grace, stepped down with her children. She kept her eyes on Jacob, still trying to understand this strange man who had given away everything for strangers. The children moved cautiously, staying close to her, scanning the place as if waiting for some hidden trap to spring. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood. There were only 2 rooms, a kitchen with a rickety table and a sleeping area with straw-filled mattresses. Jacob gestured toward the kitchen. "There's bread and beans," he said. "You're welcome to stay the night, or as long as you need." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded, and they sat. For a few minutes, the only sound was chewing and the clink of spoons on tin bowls. No one spoke. But in the silence, something fragile began to grow. Over the next few days, they remained. Grace helped sweep the dust out of the house and wash clothes at the well. The children, once quiet and skittish, began exploring the yard, laughing as they chased each other in the tall grass. Jacob repaired the broken door hinges and mended the fence with the eldest son, Elijah, who said little but worked with quiet strength. At night, they sat together by the fireplace. Jacob spoke of his wife and son. Grace shared pieces of her life before captivity, how she used to sing while sewing, how her children once had their own garden. Slowly, story by story, meal by meal, sorrow gave way to something sturdier. They weren't bound by blood. They hadn't chosen each other in the usual way. But in those quiet, shared acts of survival and kindness, they became something more than guests, more than strangers. They were becoming a family, not by birth, but by choice. And in a world that had stolen so much, that choice was everything. Word traveled fast in Delaney. Within days of Jacob Rowan bringing Grace and her 5 children home, the whispers started, low and bitter, curling through church pews and saloon doors like smoke from a bad fire. People couldn't understand what he had done. Some said he was crazy, still broken from grief. Others thought it was worse, that he'd shamed his own race by giving dignity to people meant only for labor. But Jacob didn't care about the talk. He'd lived through the worst kind of loss. He wasn't afraid of idle mouths. What he hadn't expected was how quickly whispers would turn into threats. It began with stares. Cold ones. Men who used to tip their hats now crossed the street. Women who once brought pies after his wife died now clutched their children close when they passed. A shopkeeper refused to sell him nails. "You want to build something," he said, "you can do it somewhere else." Then, one night, a crude message was carved into his barn door: "Traitor." The next night, a bundle of smoldering rags was tossed onto his porch. The wind blew it out before it caught, but the meaning was clear. Grace urged him to let them leave. "They're angry because of us," she said softly. "We can go. You've already done enough." Jacob shook his head. "No. This is your home now. If they want to be angry, let them be. But they won't scare us out." But the threats escalated. One morning, Elijah returned from town with a bloodied lip. He defended his little sister from a boy who spat on her and called her a dog. The boy's father threatened to have Elijah arrested, or worse. When Jacob rode into town to confront the sheriff, he was met with silence and shrugged shoulders. "You brought this on yourself," the sheriff muttered. That night, Jacob sat at the table while the children slept. His hands trembled with rage and helplessness. Grace placed a hand over his. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. "I'm not," he whispered. "But I won't let them take what we've built." And so they stood together. Elijah began working openly in town, holding his head high. Grace volunteered at the church, ignoring the side glances. Jacob rebuilt the barn door with Elijah beside him, carving over the slur with words of his own: "We all belong." One morning, a neighbor arrived with a sack of seed. He didn't say much, just nodded, dropped it on the porch, and left. A few days later, a widow from the next homestead came with a pie. No apology. Just kindness. A crack had formed in the wall of hate. The threats didn't disappear overnight, but something else had taken root, something stronger than fear. Jacob hadn't just changed his life or theirs. He had drawn a line in the soil and declared that dignity had a place here, even if no one else believed it yet. The town had tried to tear them down, but all they'd done was show just how strong they really were. The sun rose over Delaney with a kind of warmth the town hadn't felt in years. The field surrounding Jacob Rowan's farm, once dry and brittle from neglect, now shimmered with tall stalks of corn, golden wheat, and rows of green beans and squash. The land, much like the people who worked it, had been scarred and silent for too long. But now, it thrived, not because of luck, but because of love, labor, and a shared will to grow something good from the ashes. It was harvest season, and laughter echoed across the property. The children ran through the rows with baskets too big for their arms, chasing each other between turns of honest work. Grace sang as she picked tomatoes, her voice rising like a hymn over the field. Elijah and Jacob worked side by side, sweat rolling down their backs, moving with practiced rhythm and shared purpose. The once crumbling farmhouse stood taller, freshly painted with mismatched boards and patched windows, a symbol of something imperfect but whole. Neighbors started stopping by, not just out of curiosity, but with their own baskets in hand. They offered eggs, flour, tools, and time. Many came without words, unsure how to cross the bridge between past silence and new understanding. Jacob didn't ask for explanations. He just nodded and welcomed them in. Grace always made extra food. The children set more places at the table. One afternoon, a stranger arrived with a notepad and questions. He was a reporter from Houston, having heard stories about a white farmer who'd bought a slave family just to set them free, and then lived with them as kin. The man couldn't believe what he saw. "You live together?" he asked, glancing around the table where Grace fed her youngest daughter a spoonful of stew. Jacob replied simply, "We don't just live together. We built this place together." The article spread further than Jacob imagined. Letters began to arrive, from people across the West, some praising, some questioning, and a few condemning. But the farm continued, untouched by opinion, rooted in something deeper than headlines. Then came the harvest celebration. It wasn't planned, just happened, neighbors gathering with food and instruments, children running barefoot, elders swaying to music by firelight. For the first time, black and white families shared a meal on equal ground in Delaney. No titles. No chains. Just people. Jacob stood at the edge of the field that night, watching the glow of lanterns, hearing the sound of laughter, real, full, alive. Grace stepped beside him, her hand finding his. "You know," she said quietly, "you changed this town." He shook his head. "We all did. Together." And as the stars blinked to life overhead, something stirred in the soil and in the hearts of those gathered. The harvest was more than food, it was healing. It was proof that one act of kindness, rooted in courage, could bloom into something that fed an entire community. And from that day forward, Delaney was never quite the same.